Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast precipice, the wind howling around you as you peer into the abyss below. This is the moment Friedrich Nietzsche described when he spoke of the necessity of confronting the void within ourselves and the world around us. You are here because something deep within your soul has grown restless with the comfortable lies, the social pleasantries, and the endless compromises that have slowly, methodically, stripped away your authentic self. You stand here because you sense that freedom, real freedom, requires something that terrifies most people, the willingness to engage in conflict. But what is this freedom Nietzsche spoke of so passionately? It is not the political freedom promised by constitutions or the economic freedom offered by markets. It is something far more fundamental and infinitely more dangerous to the established order. The freedom to become who you truly are, unshackled from the expectations, moral codes, and value systems imposed upon you by others. This is the freedom of the Übermensch, the overman, who has transcended the herd mentality and created his own values from the raw materials of existence. You've been conditioned from birth to avoid conflict, to seek harmony, to be agreeable. Your parents, teachers, and society at large have whispered in your ear that good people don't rock the boat, that wisdom lies in compromise, that peace is always preferable to confrontation. They have taught you to fear the uncomfortable tension that arises when your authentic desires clash with social expectations, when your deepest convictions challenge the status quo, when your emerging self threatens to upset the delicate balance of relationships and institutions that surround you. Yet Nietzsche understood something that most of humanity refuses to acknowledge. This very avoidance of conflict is what keeps you enslaved. Every time you bite your tongue when you should speak truth, every time you conform when you should rebel, every time you choose the path of least resistance when you should forge your own way, you are trading pieces of your soul for the temporary comfort of social acceptance. You are choosing the security of the herd over the terrifying magnificence of individual authenticity. Consider the life you live now, the careful negotiations you make daily with your own conscience. You wake each morning and don the mask that society expects, speaking the words that others want to hear, pursuing goals that were never truly your own. You move through your days like an actor who has forgotten he's performing. So thoroughly have you internalized the script written by others. This is what Nietzsche called the last man, the person who has eliminated all risk, all struggle, all genuine conflict from his existence in exchange for a kind of spiritual hibernation. The last man, Nietzsche warned, believes he has discovered happiness, but it is the happiness of cattle in a pasture, fed, safe, and utterly without purpose beyond consumption and comfort. You see these people everywhere, in the offices where they perform meaningless tasks with artificial enthusiasm, in the suburban neighbourhoods where they tend their lawns with religious devotion, in the social gatherings where they exchange pleasantries like currency, each interaction carefully calibrated to avoid any genuine human contact that might disrupt the fragile equilibrium of their existence. But you are reading these words because something within you rebels against this fate. Some spark of the authentic self refuses to be extinguished, continues to burn despite your best efforts to smother it with conformity and compromise. This is the voice that whispers in the quiet moments, telling you that you were meant for something more than this elaborate performance of normalcy. This is the part of you that Nietzsche would recognize as having the potential for greatness, not the greatness measured by worldly success, but the greatness of someone who dares to live according to his own values rather than those inherited from others. The tragedy is that most people feel this spark and then immediately rush to extinguish it, terrified of where it might lead. They sense that honoring this authentic voice would require them to challenge relationships, careers, beliefs, and institutions that currently provide structure and meaning to their lives. They imagine the conflicts that would inevitably arise, with family members who expect them to remain the person they have always been, with employers who demand conformity to corporate culture, with friends who are comfortable with the current dynamic and would resist any change. So they choose the path of internal conflict instead, waging a quiet war against their own nature, slowly suffocating the very thing that makes them unique and vital. They tell themselves that this is maturity, that this is wisdom, that this is what responsible adults do. But Nietzsche would say they have confused cowardice with virtue, and in doing so they have chosen a kind of living death. To understand why you fear conflict so deeply, you must trace the genealogy of this fear back to its origins. Nietzsche spent much of his intellectual life examining how moral values develop and why certain attitudes become so deeply embedded in human psychology that they feel natural and inevitable rather than learned and contingent. The fear of conflict is not innate. It is carefully cultivated by systems of power that benefit from your compliance. From your earliest moments of consciousness, you were taught that your value as a human being depended on your ability to please others. Your parents smiled when you were obedient and frowned when you asserted your will. Your teachers rewarded conformity and punished any behavior that disrupted the classroom's artificial harmony. Your peers included you in their groups when you adapted to their expectations and excluded you when you dared to be different. Slowly, inexorably, you learned that survival, both physical and social, required the suppression of any impulses that might create friction with those around you. This conditioning runs so deep that you may not even recognize it as conditioning. The voice in your head that warns you away from conflict feels like your own voice, like the voice of reason and prudence. When you consider speaking your mind at a family gathering where your political views differ from those of your relatives, this voice whispers that such honesty would only cause pain and accomplish nothing. When you think about leaving a career that drains your soul but provides financial security, this voice reminds you of your responsibilities and obligations. When you contemplate ending a relationship that has become stagnant and unfulfilling, this voice speaks of loyalty and commitment. But Nietzsche would ask you to examine whose interests are truly served by this voice. Is it really protecting you, or is it protecting the systems and relationships that depend on your continued compliance? Is it really motivated by love and wisdom, or by fear and the desire to maintain the status quo? When you dig beneath the surface of these seemingly reasonable concerns, you often find that they are not expressions of your authentic values, but internalized commands from external authorities who benefit from your obedience. The church benefits when you suppress your natural desires and submit to moral codes that were designed to control rather than liberate. The state benefits when you accept its authority without question and channel your energy into approved activities rather than challenging unjust laws or corrupt institutions. The economy benefits when you define yourself primarily as a consumer and worker, rather than as a creator and free spirit. Your family benefits when you remain locked in familiar roles, rather than evolving into someone they might not recognize or approve of. This is not to say that all external influences are malicious, or that society serves no beneficial function. But Nietzsche understood that any system of values imposed from the outside, no matter how well intentioned, ultimately becomes a prison if it is not consciously chosen and continuously re-evaluated by the individual. The problem is not that you have relationships and responsibilities and social connections. The problem is that you have allowed these things to define you completely, leaving no room for the emergence of your authentic self. At the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy lies the concept of the will to power, not power over others in the crude sense of domination, but power over oneself, the power to create meaning, to establish values, to become who you are meant to be rather than who others expect you to be. This will to power is the fundamental drive of all life, the force that pushes every organism to grow, to expand, to overcome obstacles and limitations in the pursuit of its fullest expression. But you have been taught to be suspicious of this drive, to see it as selfish or dangerous. You've been told that virtue lies in self-sacrifice, that the highest good is to serve others, that your own desires and ambitions are less important than the needs of the group. This teaching has a noble sound to it, and there is certainly wisdom in considering the welfare of others. But when taken to extremes, this philosophy becomes a tool of oppression, encouraging you to treat your own life as less valuable than the comfort and convenience of those around you. Nietzsche saw through this false nobility and recognized it for what it often is, a sophisticated form of control that keeps potentially dangerous individuals, those with the capacity for independent thought and creative action, safely neutered and compliant. By convincing you that your authentic desires are selfish and that conflict is always destructive, those who benefit from the current order ensure that you will never pose a serious challenge to their authority. But what if conflict is not always destructive? What if it is sometimes the only path to growth, creativity, and authentic relationship? What if the very attempt to avoid all conflict is what creates the most pernicious forms of dysfunction? The passive aggression, the resentment, the slow poisoning of relationships and institutions that occurs when problems are never addressed directly. Consider the relationships in your life that have real depth and vitality. Chances are these are relationships that have weathered significant conflicts and emerged stronger as a result. The friends who have stayed with you through genuine disagreements, who've been willing to challenge you when you were wrong and to be challenged by you in return. The romantic partnerships that have grown deeper through the honest confrontation of differences rather than the careful avoidance of anything controversial. The professional collaborations that have produced truly innovative work because the participants were willing to fight for their ideas rather than settling for bland compromise. These relationships demonstrate what Nietzsche understood intuitively, that conflict, properly engaged, is not the enemy of connection but its necessary foundation. It is only by risking the loss of relationship that you can discover whether the relationship is worth having. It is only by being willing to displease others that you can learn whether their approval is based on who you really are or on their projection of who they want you to be. Nietzsche distinguished between two fundamental types of morality: slave morality and master morality. Slave morality, which has dominated Western civilization for centuries, defines good and evil in reactive terms. Something is good if it does not threaten or challenge the status quo, and something is evil if it disrupts the comfortable equilibrium that the slaves mistake for virtue. This morality prizes humility, obedience, selflessness, and peace above all else. Not because these qualities are intrinsically valuable, but because they serve the interests of those who benefit from a compliant population. Master morality, by contrast, is creative rather than reactive. It does not accept existing definitions of good and evil, but creates new values based on what enhances life, promotes growth, and enables the fullest expression of human potential. The person who embodies master morality, the Übermensch, does not ask whether his actions will be approved by others, but whether they are authentic expressions of his deepest nature and highest aspirations. This does not mean that the Übermensch is cruel or indifferent to others. Rather, it means that he recognizes that the greatest gift he can give to the world is the full development of his own unique capacities and perspectives. By becoming completely himself, he adds something new and valuable to human existence that could never have emerged through conformity to existing patterns. But becoming this authentic self requires you to embrace what Nietzsche called the eternal recurrence, the willingness to live your life in such a way that you would be willing to repeat it exactly as it is, over and over again, for all eternity. This thought experiment forces you to confront the question of whether you are truly living according to your own values or merely going through the motions of a life designed by others. If the thought of repeating your current existence fills you with horror or despair, this is a sign that you've been living according to slave morality, allowing fear of conflict to prevent you from pursuing the experiences and relationships and creative work that would make your life feel genuinely worth living. The eternal recurrence demands that you take full responsibility for your choices and their consequences, that you stop blaming others for your unhappiness and start taking the bold actions necessary to create a life you can affirm without reservation. One of the most challenging aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy is his recognition that creation requires destruction, that something must die for something new to be born. This is why the path to freedom inevitably involves conflict, not because conflict is inherently good, but because the old structures that confine you will not simply step aside to make room for your authentic self. They must be actively challenged, resisted, and ultimately transcended. This process begins with the destruction of your own illusions about who you are and what you want. You must be willing to examine the stories you tell yourself about your motivations, your relationships, your career, your beliefs. You must be prepared to discover that many of the things you thought were important to you were actually important to other people, and that many of the values you assumed were your own were merely inherited from sources you never consciously chose to trust. This internal house cleaning is often more difficult than any external conflict because it requires you to acknowledge how much of your life has been built on foundations of sand. It means admitting that you may have wasted years pursuing goals that never truly excited you, maintaining relationships that never truly nourished you, defending beliefs that never truly convinced you. The temptation is enormous to avoid this painful self-examination by focusing instead on external enemies and obstacles. But Nietzsche insisted that authentic transformation must begin from within. Once you have begun the work of internal clarification, however, external conflicts become inevitable. As you start to live more authentically, you will necessarily challenge the expectations that others have placed upon you. Family members who are comfortable with your current role in the family system will resist your attempts to change that role. Friends who have grown accustomed to a particular dynamic will be threatened by your newfound willingness to speak honestly rather than diplomatically. Employers who have benefited from your compliance will be disturbed by your sudden insistence on pursuing work that aligns with your values, rather than simply collecting a paycheck. These conflicts are not unfortunate side effects of personal growth. They are essential components of it. Each confrontation is an opportunity to practice standing up for your authentic self, to test whether your new values can withstand pressure from those who preferred the old you. Each time you choose honesty over harmony, each time you prioritize your own development over others' comfort, each time you refuse to compromise your emerging identity for the sake of temporary peace, you are taking another step toward the kind of freedom that cannot be granted by external authorities, but must be claimed through your own courage and determination. One of the most difficult aspects of embracing conflict as a path to freedom is the inevitable loneliness that accompanies this journey. As you begin to live more authentically, you will discover that many of the relationships you thought were based on genuine connection were actually based on mutual accommodation and the careful avoidance of anything that might disturb the superficial harmony. Nietzsche knew this loneliness intimately. His willingness to challenge the fundamental assumptions of his time about religion, morality, truth, and human nature left him increasingly isolated from the academic and social circles that had once provided him with companionship and support. Yet he understood that this isolation was the price of intellectual and spiritual honesty, and that the alternative, the warm embrace of the herd, would have meant the death of everything that made him unique and valuable. You may find yourself facing similar choices. As you begin to speak more honestly about your thoughts and feelings, some people will withdraw from you, uncomfortable with the level of authenticity you're bringing to interactions that they preferred to keep on the surface. As you start to pursue work that genuinely excites you rather than work that simply pays the bills, you may lose touch with colleagues who cannot understand your willingness to sacrifice security for meaning. As you begin to question beliefs and assumptions that you once shared with others, you may find yourself increasingly alone in your spiritual and intellectual journey. This loneliness is real, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But Nietzsche would argue that it is a more honest loneliness than the false connection that characterizes so much of social life. Better to be alone with your authentic self than surrounded by people who love only the mask you wear for their comfort. Better to have a few relationships based on genuine understanding than dozens of relationships based on mutual self-deception. Moreover, as you continue on this path, you will begin to attract people who are drawn to authenticity rather than conformity, who appreciate your willingness to speak honestly rather than diplomatically, who value your commitment to growth over your commitment to stability. These relationships, when they do develop, have a depth and vitality that is impossible to achieve when both parties are primarily concerned with avoiding conflict. The loneliness of the authentic path is also the solitude necessary for creative work. It is in the quiet moments, away from the constant pressure to conform to others' expectations, that you can hear the voice of your own deepest nature. It is in the space created by your willingness to risk disapproval that new ideas, new art, new ways of being in the world can emerge. Understanding that conflict is necessary for freedom does not mean that all conflicts are equally valuable, or that confrontation should be pursued without wisdom and discrimination. Nietzsche was not advocating for random antagonism or destructive behavior, but for the strategic use of conflict as a tool for personal and creative development. The art of strategic conflict begins with the recognition that not every battle is worth fighting. Some conflicts are distractions from the deeper work of self-creation, opportunities for others to drain your energy and attention away from your authentic priorities. Learning to distinguish between conflicts that serve your growth and conflicts that merely serve others' need for drama is an essential skill for anyone committed to living authentically. Strategic conflict also requires you to choose your timing carefully. There are moments when confrontation will be productive, and moments when it will simply create unnecessary chaos. The key is to engage in conflict from a position of strength and clarity, rather than from a position of emotional reactivity or defensiveness. When you are clear about your values and committed to your path, you can engage in difficult conversations with a calm confidence that transforms the entire dynamic. Furthermore, strategic conflict is not about winning in the conventional sense, but about creating space for truth to emerge. The goal is not to defeat your opponent, but to clarify the real issues at stake, and to discover whether genuine understanding and respect are possible between you. Sometimes this process will result in deeper connection. Sometimes it will result in the recognition that the relationship has run its course. Both outcomes are valuable if they bring you closer to authenticity. The most sophisticated form of strategic conflict involves learning to challenge systems and structures rather than just individuals. Instead of simply arguing with people who disagree with you, you can begin to question the assumptions and frameworks that make those disagreements inevitable. Instead of trying to convince others to accept your perspective, you can work to create new possibilities that transcend the limitations of existing options. This systemic approach to conflict is what allows the Übermensch to be a creator of values rather than simply a rebel against them. Rather than spending all your energy fighting against what you oppose, you can focus primarily on building what you support. This positive approach to conflict is ultimately more effective because it offers people something to move toward, rather than simply something to move away from. Nietzsche's concept of creative destruction recognizes that all genuine creation requires the willingness to destroy existing forms that have outlived their usefulness. This principle applies not only to external structures, but to the internal patterns and beliefs that shape your own life. The process of becoming who you are meant to be necessarily involves the destruction of who you've been told you should be. This destruction is not nihilistic but generative, like a forest fire that clears away dead growth to make room for new life. The conflicts you engage in as you pursue authenticity serve to eliminate the relationships, activities, and beliefs that no longer serve your highest development. The pain of this process is real, but it is the pain of birth rather than the pain of death. Consider the various identities you have worn throughout your life: the good student, the dutiful child, the reliable employee, the accommodating friend. Each of these identities served a purpose at the time, providing you with a sense of place and belonging in the world. But they were always temporary constructions, useful fictions that helped you navigate particular phases of your development. The mistake is to cling to these identities beyond their expiration date, to continue playing roles that no longer reflect your evolving understanding of yourself and your possibilities. The creative destruction of these outdated identities requires courage because it means stepping into uncertainty. When you stop being the person others expect you to be, you face the terrifying question of who you will become instead. There is no guarantee that the new self that emerges will be more successful or more popular than the old self. In fact, authenticity often makes life more difficult in the short term because it eliminates the easy options and comfortable compromises that make conventional life manageable. But this uncertainty is also freedom. When you're no longer bound by others' expectations or your own past choices, you are free to explore possibilities that were previously invisible to you. You can pursue work that excites you rather than work that impresses others. You can form relationships based on genuine affinity rather than social convenience. You can align your daily actions with your deepest values rather than with external pressures and obligations. The creative force unleashed by this destruction is what Nietzsche called the will to power in its highest form. Not the crude desire to dominate others, but the sophisticated ability to create meaning and value from the raw materials of existence. This is the power that artists use to transform blank canvases into expressions of beauty, that entrepreneurs use to transform ideas into enterprises, that lovers use to transform attraction into enduring partnerships. It is the power that lies dormant within you until you find the courage to destroy the barriers that prevent its expression. One of Nietzsche's most revolutionary insights was his recognition that values themselves are human creations rather than eternal truths discovered through reason or revelation. This means that you have not only the right but the responsibility to evaluate the values you've inherited and to modify or replace them as necessary to support your fullest development as a human being. This transvaluation of values is perhaps the most radical form of conflict, because it challenges not just specific rules or expectations, but the entire framework within which rules and expectations are established. When you begin to question whether success should be measured by wealth accumulation, or whether morality should be based on divine commandments, or whether happiness should be pursued through pleasure-seeking, you are engaging in the kind of fundamental inquiry that threatens the stability of entire civilizations. Most people find this level of questioning too frightening to pursue seriously. It is much easier to accept the values you are given and to focus your energy on living up to them than to take responsibility for consciously choosing the principles that will guide your life. But Nietzsche understood that this acceptance comes at an enormous cost, the loss of your own creative potential and the reduction of your life to a mere repetition of patterns established by others. The process of transvaluation begins with the recognition that the values you currently hold were not chosen by you, but given to you by your family, your education, your culture, and your historical moment. This does not make them wrong, but it does make them contingent. They are options among many possible options, and you have the right to evaluate them based on whether they serve your authentic development or hinder it. This evaluation requires you to look beyond the surface appeal of various values to examine their actual effects on your life and the lives of others. Does the value of financial security actually make you more secure, or does it make you more fearful and risk-averse? Does the value of social harmony actually create more love and connection, or does it create more superficiality and resentment? Does the value of moral purity actually make you more ethical, or does it make you more judgmental and self-righteous? The answers to these questions will vary from person to person, because each individual has different needs, capacities, and circumstances. What matters is not finding the right answers, but finding the answers that are right for you. The values that enable you to live with passion, creativity, and integrity, rather than with resignation, conformity, and internal conflict. As you engage in this process of conscious value creation, you will inevitably come into conflict with those who are still operating according to the values you are questioning. They will see your transvaluation as a threat to their own choices and will often respond with hostility or attempts to pull you back into the familiar patterns. This conflict is unavoidable, but it is also necessary if you are to claim your freedom to live according to your own deepest understanding rather than according to inherited scripts. Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence poses a crucial test for anyone seeking freedom through the embrace of conflict. If you knew that you would have to live your entire life exactly as you are living it now, over and over again for all eternity, would you be able to affirm that life without reservation? This thought experiment forces you to confront whether you're truly living according to your own values, or merely going through the motions of a life designed by others. The eternal recurrence is not meant as a literal description of the nature of existence, but as a psychological tool for evaluating the authenticity of your choices. If the thought of repeating your current existence fills you with enthusiasm and joy, this suggests that you are living in alignment with your deepest nature. If the thought fills you with horror or despair, this suggests that you are allowing fear of conflict to prevent you from pursuing the experiences and relationships that would make your life feel genuinely worth living. Most people, when confronted with this test, discover that they are not living lives they would willingly repeat. They are spending their days in jobs that drain their energy, maintaining relationships that provide little genuine nourishment, pursuing goals that were imposed upon them by others rather than chosen by themselves. They are avoiding the conflicts that would be necessary to change these circumstances because they have been taught to fear confrontation more than they fear the slow death of their authentic selves. But the eternal recurrence also offers hope. Every moment presents a new opportunity to begin living more authentically. You do not have to continue repeating the patterns that have defined your life thus far. You can begin making different choices that reflect your actual values rather than your inherited programming. You can start having the difficult conversations that you have been avoiding, pursuing the creative work that excites you, ending the relationships that have become stagnant, beginning the adventures that call to your deepest nature. The key insight is that authentic choice always involves risk, and almost always involves conflict. When you choose to leave a secure but unfulfilling job to pursue meaningful work, you create conflict with those who value security over meaning. When you choose to speak honestly in a relationship rather than maintaining a comfortable facade, you create conflict with those who prefer harmony to truth. When you choose to live according to your own values rather than inherited expectations, you create conflict with all the forces, internal and external, that benefit from your compliance. But this conflict is the price of freedom, and the eternal recurrence teaches you that it is a price worth paying. Better to live one life that you can fully affirm than 1,000 lives that leave you feeling empty and defeated. Better to engage in the conflicts necessary for authentic self-expression than to avoid all conflict and thereby avoid all genuine life. While the path to freedom necessarily involves periods of loneliness and isolation, it does not lead to permanent alienation from all human connection. Rather, it leads to a different kind of community, what Nietzsche called the fellowship of free spirits who have done the difficult work of liberating themselves from inherited values and social expectations. These free spirits recognize each other not by their conformity to shared beliefs, but by their commitment to ongoing self-creation, and their refusal to be constrained by conventional limitations. They can engage in deep friendship and love precisely because they are not trying to use relationships as a means of avoiding the fundamental challenges of existence. They can be honest with each other because they are not dependent on others' approval for their sense of self-worth. The community of free spirits is not exclusive or elitist in the conventional sense. It is open to anyone who is willing to do the difficult work of questioning inherited assumptions and taking responsibility for creating their own values. But it does require a level of courage and intellectual honesty that many people find too demanding. It requires the willingness to stand alone when necessary and to risk the loss of comfortable relationships in pursuit of authentic connection. This community is also not utopian. Free spirits will still disagree with each other, still come into conflict over important issues, still struggle with the challenges of communication and understanding. But these conflicts will be engaged openly and creatively rather than avoided or suppressed. They will be opportunities for growth and learning rather than threats to be neutralized through compromise or withdrawal. The existence of this community provides both inspiration and practical support for your own journey toward freedom. Knowing that others have successfully navigated the challenges of authentic living makes your own efforts feel less impossible. Having access to people who understand the value of conflict as a tool for growth provides encouragement during the difficult periods when your commitment to authenticity is being tested. But ultimately, you cannot depend on this community to provide you with the courage or wisdom necessary for your own liberation. Each person must walk the path alone, must face their own fears, must engage in their own conflicts with the forces that seek to keep them small and compliant. The community can offer support and understanding, but it cannot do the work for you. Embracing conflict as a path to freedom is not a one-time decision, but an ongoing practice that must be renewed daily through countless small acts of courage and authenticity. Each time you choose honesty over diplomacy, each time you pursue your genuine interests rather than what others expect of you, each time you speak up for your values, even when it creates discomfort, you're strengthening your capacity for the kind of conflict that leads to liberation. This practice begins with developing a more honest relationship with yourself. You must learn to recognize when you are acting from fear rather than from authentic choice, when you're saying yes to avoid conflict rather than because you genuinely want to participate, when you are suppressing your own needs and desires to maintain others' comfort. This self-awareness is the foundation of all authentic action, because you cannot change patterns that you do not recognize. The practice also involves learning to tolerate the discomfort that conflict inevitably creates. Most people avoid difficult conversations not because they lack the skills to navigate them, but because they cannot bear the anxiety, uncertainty, and emotional intensity that such conversations generate. Developing your capacity to remain present and responsive in the face of this discomfort is essential for anyone who wants to use conflict as a tool for growth rather than destruction. Furthermore, the practice requires you to cultivate what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, the ability to embrace whatever life presents to you, including the conflicts and challenges that arise as a result of your commitment to authenticity. This does not mean becoming passive or fatalistic, but rather recognizing that the obstacles you encounter are often the very experiences that provide opportunities for growth and self-discovery. The practice of courageous authenticity also involves learning to distinguish between conflicts that serve your development and conflicts that simply drain your energy. Not every disagreement is worth pursuing, and not every relationship is worth saving. Wisdom lies in knowing when to engage and when to withdraw, when to fight for change and when to accept what cannot be changed, when to seek understanding and when to simply maintain boundaries. As you develop this practice, you will find that your relationship to conflict begins to shift. Instead of seeing it as something to be avoided at all costs, you will begin to see it as a natural and necessary part of any meaningful life. You will develop confidence in your ability to navigate difficult situations without losing your center or compromising your integrity. You will discover that most conflicts, when engaged with skill and courage, lead to greater clarity and deeper connection rather than to destruction and loss. Ultimately, Nietzsche's vision of the Übermensch is not about becoming superhuman in any literal sense, but about becoming fully human, about realizing the creative, courageous, and compassionate potential that lies dormant within every person who has the courage to break free from the constraints of inherited values and social expectations. The Übermensch is not a destination, but a direction, not a fixed state, but an ongoing process of becoming. The legacy you leave through your commitment to authentic living extends far beyond your own personal liberation. Every time you choose courage over comfort, truth over harmony, growth over security, you are modeling a different way of being human for everyone around you. You are demonstrating that it is possible to live according to your own values, rather than simply inheriting the values of your culture and your family. This modeling is particularly important in a time when so many people feel trapped by circumstances that seem beyond their control, when economic pressures and social expectations make authentic living seem like a luxury that only the privileged can afford. By showing that freedom is available to anyone willing to embrace the conflicts necessary for self-creation, you're offering a gift of immeasurable value to a world that has largely forgotten the possibility of genuine liberation. The path you're walking is not easy, and there are no guarantees of external success or social approval. But there is something far more valuable available: the satisfaction of knowing that you have lived according to your own deepest understanding, that you have contributed something unique and irreplaceable to the human experience, that you have refused to allow fear to prevent you from becoming who you were meant to be. This is the freedom that Nietzsche envisioned. Not freedom from all constraints, but freedom to choose your constraints consciously. Not freedom from all conflict, but freedom to engage in conflicts that serve your highest development. Not freedom from all suffering, but freedom to transform suffering into wisdom and growth. It is a freedom that must be claimed rather than granted, earned rather than inherited, renewed rather than possessed. The choice is always before you. Will you continue to avoid the conflicts that would liberate you from inherited limitations? Or will you find the courage to engage in the struggles that lead to authentic self-creation? Will you remain in the comfortable prison of social expectations? Or will you risk the uncertainty and loneliness that come with forging your own path? Will you live the life that others have designed for you? Or will you claim the freedom to design your own life according to your deepest values and highest aspirations? The answer to these questions will determine not only the quality of your own existence, but the legacy you leave for future generations. In a world that desperately needs examples of courage, authenticity, and creative self-expression, your willingness to embrace conflict as a path to freedom becomes a gift, not only to yourself, but to all those who will follow in your footsteps. The choice to stop being afraid of conflict is ultimately the choice to start being fully alive. Nietzsche's allegory of the three metamorphoses, the camel, the lion, and the child, provides a roadmap for understanding the stages you must pass through as you learn to embrace conflict as a path to freedom. Each stage represents a different relationship to the burdens and expectations that society places upon you, and each requires its own form of courage and wisdom. You begin as the camel, dutifully bearing the heavy loads that others place upon your back. This is the stage of life where you accept without question the values, beliefs, and expectations that have been handed down to you. You pride yourself on your ability to carry these burdens without complaint. To meet others' expectations, even when doing so, requires you to sacrifice your own desires and authentic impulses. The camel believes that virtue lies in endurance, that strength is measured by how much weight you can bear without breaking. But there comes a moment when the camel realizes that no amount of dutiful service will ever be enough, that the loads will only grow heavier, that the approval of others is a currency that loses its value the moment it is earned. This realization marks the beginning of the transformation into the lion, the stage where you learn to say no to the demands that have been placed upon you, where you develop the courage to roar your refusal at the structures that have confined you. The lion represents the destructive phase of liberation, the period when you must actively fight against the inherited values and social expectations that have shaped your life. This is where the willingness to engage in conflict becomes absolutely crucial. The lion cannot simply ignore the cage, it must actively break free from it. This requires aggression, not in the sense of cruelty toward others, but in the sense of fierce determination to protect your emerging authenticity from all forces that would suppress it. During your lion phase, you will find yourself in conflict with almost everyone and everything that previously defined your identity. Family members who benefited from your compliance will resist your newfound assertiveness. Employers who counted on your willingness to accept unsatisfying work will be threatened by your insistence on meaningful employment. Friends who are comfortable with superficial interactions will be disturbed by your demand for deeper honesty and connection. These conflicts are necessary and unavoidable. The lion must learn to use its strength not to dominate others, but to create space for its own authentic existence. This requires developing new skills, the ability to set boundaries without guilt, to disappoint others without losing your sense of self-worth, to stand alone when necessary without succumbing to loneliness or despair. The lion learns that freedom is not given but taken, not granted but claimed through the exercise of will and courage. But the lion, for all its strength and courage, is still fundamentally reactive. It defines itself in opposition to what it rejects rather than in affirmation of what it embraces. This is why the final transformation into the child is necessary for complete liberation. The child represents the creative phase of freedom, the stage where you move beyond merely rejecting inherited values to actively creating new ones that reflect your deepest understanding of what makes life worth living. The child approaches existence with wonder and playfulness, unencumbered by the heavy seriousness that characterizes both the dutiful camel and the rebellious lion. The child does not need to fight against constraints because it has transcended them, not through force but through a kind of creative indifference that renders them irrelevant. The child creates values naturally and spontaneously, the way children create games, not because they serve some external purpose, but because the act of creation itself is joyful and meaningful. This transformation from camel to lion to child represents your journey from unconscious conformity through conscious rebellion to creative transcendence. Each stage builds upon the previous one, and each requires its own relationship to conflict. The camel avoids conflict at all costs, the lion embraces conflict as a necessary weapon, and the child transcends conflict by creating new possibilities that make old conflicts obsolete. One of the most challenging aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy is his insistence that suffering is not something to be avoided, but something to be transformed into wisdom, strength, and creative power. This transformation, what he sometimes called the alchemy of suffering, is impossible without the willingness to engage in the conflicts that suffering inevitably brings. Most people, when faced with suffering, seek to escape it as quickly as possible. They numb themselves with distractions, blame others for their pain, or retreat into fantasies of how things should be different. But Nietzsche understood that this approach wastes the transformative potential that lies hidden within every form of suffering. Pain becomes meaningful only when it is consciously engaged and actively transformed into something greater. The conflicts you face as you pursue authentic living will inevitably involve suffering. You will lose relationships that were important to you, even if they were ultimately limiting. You will disappoint people whose approval you value, even when that approval was contingent on your continued self-suppression. You will face uncertainty about who you are becoming, even as you grow more confident about who you no longer wish to be. But this suffering is qualitatively different from the suffering that comes from avoiding authentic living. When you suffer in service of your growth and self-expression, the pain has meaning and direction. It is the pain of birth rather than the pain of slow death, the pain of expansion rather than the pain of contraction. It hurts, but it hurts in the way that exercise hurts, with the promise of increased strength and capacity on the other side. The alchemy of suffering requires you to develop what Nietzsche called intellectual probity, the commitment to honesty about your own experience, even when that experience is uncomfortable or unflattering. This means acknowledging your own role in creating the situations that cause you pain, recognizing the ways that your past choices have contributed to your current circumstances, and taking responsibility for the work of transformation, rather than waiting for external conditions to change. This intellectual probity extends to your relationship with conflict itself. You must be honest about the ways that avoiding conflict has actually created more suffering in your life than engaging it would have. You must acknowledge the cost of your compliance, the resentment that builds when you consistently choose others' comfort over your own authenticity, the slow erosion of self-respect that occurs when you repeatedly betray your own values to maintain false peace. But the alchemy of suffering also requires something beyond mere honesty. It requires what Nietzsche called gay science, the ability to approach even the most difficult experiences with the spirit of curiosity and experimentation, rather than grim determination. This does not mean making light of genuine pain, but rather maintaining enough lightness of spirit to see possibilities for growth and learning, even in the midst of challenging circumstances. When you approach conflict with this spirit of gay science, it becomes less frightening and more interesting. Instead of seeing disagreements as threats to be avoided, you begin to see them as opportunities to test your ideas, to clarify your values, to discover new aspects of yourself and others. Instead of approaching difficult conversations with dread, you begin to approach them with something resembling anticipation, not because you enjoy conflict for its own sake, but because you have learned to trust your ability to navigate challenge and to find meaning in struggle.